Hi, my name is Steve Morse, and I'll be speaking to you today about the 1950 census and how to find people in that census both with and without a name index. Throughout this talk, I'll be making reference to something called the One-Step website. That's a website that I created, and it has many tools that are helpful for searching in the census, and they are all free. The census was taken in April 1950. Here's a calendar from that month showing that we were indeed in the Pepsi generation. The work described in this talk was done jointly by myself and Joel Weintraub. I've worked with Joel since 2001, covering the 1930 census, then the 1940 census, and now the 1950 census. April 1, 1950 is referred to as the census day for the 1950 census. That doesn't mean that the census taker came to everyone's door on that day. Only Santa Claus can be everywhere at the same time. Rather, April 1 is the day that the questions in the census pertain to. The census taker would ask who was in the household on April 1. If the census taker came to your door on April 10, he didn't want to know about your newborn baby who was born on April 5th. But he did want to know about grandfather, who unfortunately passed away on April 3rd. Uncle Sam wanted to get a snapshot of the nation as it existed on April 1. Here's a collage of what the world looked like around April 1, 1950. These are magazine covers that are as close to the April 1 date as I could find. It shows some of the news stories and styles of that time. The U.S. Census has been taken every 10 years, starting in 1790. Since 1942, all censuses have been made available to the public 72 years after the census was taken, 73 years in the case of the 1900 census. As of this recording, August 2021, the last census that was made available is the 1940 census. The census is sealed for 72 years because of life expectancy. That statement, although widely believed, is not true. We need to look at the history of the census to find out why the 72-year rule exists. From 1790 to 1870, each census was made available immediately after it was taken. One copy of the census was typically sent to Washington for archival purposes. A second copy was typically sent to the various local courthouses for all to see. Of course, all they could see was the census for that local area. In order to see the census for the entire country, they would have to travel from courthouse to courthouse. From 1880 to 1940, there was only one copy of each census, and it was sent to the Census Bureau and was kept close to the public. Statistical data about the census was released to the general public, but not the information about individual people in the census. In 1934, the National Archives was formed, and in 1942, the Census Bureau transferred most of the census records to the National Archives. The National Archives decided to open all censuses up to and including 1870 because these records had been opened previously. This established a de facto 72-year rule. In 1952, the Census Bureau transferred the 1950 census to the National Archives under the condition that all censuses remain sealed for 72 years. With that agreement, the 1880 census was released, and the 72-year rule was now well established. Here's an overview of the problems that you are going to face when the 1950 census is made available. Census Day was April 1, 1950, as already noted. The census is sealed for 72 years, also as already noted. Opening day will be on Friday, April 1, 2022. The good news is that it falls on a weekday. In 2012, April 1 fell on a Sunday, so the opening of the 1940 census was delayed to April 2. All the genealogists who waited patiently for 72 years to see the 1940 census were then told that they would have to wait one more day. In previous years, the census microfilm had been copied and sent to archives to be available on opening day. This was not the case with the 1940 census, and we anticipate that it will not be the case in 1950. Instead, the scans of the 1940 census microfilms were put directly online, making it available for free to anyone with internet access on opening day. We have every reason to believe that the same will be done for the 1950 opening. But a complete name index for the 1950 census will not exist for at least half a year after opening day. That's our best guess based on what happened for the 1940 census. The reason for the delay is that the people who will be producing the name index will not be able to see the census any sooner than you or I will. That means that the only way to access the 1950 census initially will be by address. However, the 1950 census is not organized by address, but rather by something called an enumeration district. To access the census, we need to obtain the enumeration district of our desired address. So finding people in the census will involve searching by location instead of by name. Even when a name index becomes available, there will still be many reasons for doing location searches, and I'll discuss that later. To do a location search, you need to know the enumeration district, ED, because that's how the census is organized. It is not organized by address. So what are enumeration districts? Here is an enumeration district map of St. Louis in 1930. An enumeration district, ED, is an area that can be canvassed by a single census taker, an enumerator, in one census period. Since 1880, all information in the census is organized by ED. If we don't know the ED, we cannot access the census by location. How were the EDs numbered? Since 1880, each ED within a county has a unique number. Starting in 1930, the number consists of two parts, such as 31-1582. The first part is a prefix number assigned to each county, usually alphabetically, and the second part is a district number within the county. Starting in 1940, the large cities were given their own prefix number. Such city prefix numbers come after the last county prefix, and the cities are numbered in alphabetical order. A large city in 1940 was a city with a population of 100,000 or more. In 1950, it was 50,000 or more. As an example, the number of counties in California is currently 58, and has been so since 1907. The county prefixes go from 1 Alameda County to 58 Yuba County, and those were the only prefixes in 1930. Since no counties were added or removed, the counties had the same prefixes in 1940 and also in 1950. Here are the large cities in California. Let's consider Long Beach City. It is in Los Angeles County, so in 1930 it had the prefix of 19, same as its county. In 1940, the following four cities were given their own prefixes: Long Beach, Los Angeles, Oakland, and San Diego. Long Beach, which is the first of these four cities alphabetically, was given the prefix of 59, following the highest county prefix of 58 for Yuba. In 1950, when the requirement was dropped to 50,000, another 13 cities were elevated to having their own prefix. That is, all the cities shown on this chart. And since several of these cities come alphabetically before Long Beach was now demoted to having prefix 65. Now that we know what an ED is, we need to know how to obtain the ED of the locations we are interested in. We'll illustrate that with an example, specifically finding Donald Duck in the 1950 census. Before we can determine Donald's ED, we have to know where Donald lived. If we don't already have Donald's address, here are several ways of finding it. Let's see if any of these apply to Donald. One suggestion is local newspapers and books. Well, for Donald, there are lots of books, comic books, that is. And in the March 1954 issue of Uncle Scrooge is a story titled Secrets of Atlantis. That story shows Donald going to his house at 1313 Webfoot Walk in Duckburg, Calisota. If Donald didn't move around too often, there's a good chance he was at that address in 1950. Note that we cited our source for obtaining Donald's address. It is important to do so when obtaining genealogical information so that others can check on our work and make sure that we didn't overlook anything. Well, Donald had the mystical house number of 1313. He was in good company, sharing that house number with none other than the Munsters at 1313 Mockingbird Lane, the New Adams family at 1313 Cemetery Lane, Chester Riley from The Life of Riley at 1313 Blueview Terrace, and most importantly, the Morse family at 1313 Lombard Street. My wife is very emphatic that I don't mention the city because otherwise every genealogist visiting San Francisco would show up on our doorstep. Now that we have Donald's address, it's time to obtain his enumeration district. We go to the Unified ED Finder. It's called Unified because it combines the functionality of two previous one-step tools, a large city ED Finder and a rural area ED Finder. We select the year 1950 and the state Calisota. That's a fictional Disney state, of course, and it is a cross between California and Minnesota. You might not see Calisota on the state list when you use the ED Finder, but it was there when I use it for this example, and that's what's important. After selecting Calisota, a list of some of the large cities in Calisota appears. Duckburg was indeed a large city according to Wikipedia, which at one time reported it as having a population of 300,000. Of course, most of the populace were anthropomorphized animals, so Duckburg was on the list, and we will select it. Upon selecting Duckburg, a list of the EDs in Duckburg appear. That's too many, and we'll want to narrow that down. In addition to the list of EDs in Duckburg appearing, a list of the streets in Duckburg appears. We select Webfoot Walk. Now the list of EDs is narrowed down to just those that Webfoot Walk passes through. And we are given the option of selecting a cross street in order to narrow down the list of potential EDs. We need a map of Duckburg to find out the cross street for 1313 Webfoot Walk, so we click on the map button. And that brings up a map of Duckburg, showing that 1313 Webfoot Walk is at the corner of Webfoot and Quack. So we select Quack Street, and the list of EDs is reduced to just one, namely 62-2. Now that we have the ED, we are ready to view the census images for that district. After April 1st, 2022, there will be a one-step census image tool that will let us do that, of course. We would start at the first page of the ED and look in the left margin for Webfoot Walk. We keep going page by page until we find it. We then look at the next column for 1313. When we find that, we will have Donald's census record. The 1950 census has not yet been made public, so I shouldn't be showing you any of the information that is in it. But it seems innocent enough for me to show you Donald's record, although I must ask you not to tell anyone that I've shown it to you. Here it is. The record shows that Donald is living at 1313 Webfoot Walk, that he is the head of household, he is living with his concubine Daisy, no, they never got married, and his 3 nephews. Note that one of the nephews falls on a line that is indicated as being a sample line. That means that more questions will be asked of him. Let's see what sampling is all about. On the form we just saw, there were 30 lines per page, and the sampling lines were 4, 9, 14, 19, 24, and 29. The people who fell on those 6 lines were asked additional questions, and their responses to those questions appear on 6 lines at the bottom of the form. Here we see the response for Dewey, who fell on sample line 4. In addition, the person on the last sampling line, line 29 on this particular form, was asked extra sampling questions. The answers for the extra sampling person appear at the very bottom of the form. Let's take a look as to which lines were sampled in the 1950 census. The sampling occurred every 5th line, but the first sampling line varied from sheet to sheet. On Donald's sheet, we saw that the first sampling line was on line 4, and the person on line 29 on Donald's sheet was selected for the extra sampling. Sampling was certainly a bad thing for genealogists, because unless your grandfather happened to fall on a sampling line, you are only going to get a limited number of responses for him. Let's see how and when sampling was used in the census. Before 1940, there was no sampling. There were 50 lines per page, and every one of those 50 people were asked every question. Nobody was singled out for extra scrutiny. In 1940, there were 80 lines on each sheet, including front and back, and the people on 4 of those lines, 5% of them, were singled out for sampling. There were 5 different sampling styles, line choices, in 1940, and the same style were used on every sheet within an ED so as not to confuse the enumerator. In 1950, 6 lines out of 30 on each sheet, 20%, were singled out for sampling, and the person on one of those 6 sampling lines was singled out for additional sampling. Just like in 1940, there were 5 different sampling styles used. But unlike 1940, they did use different sampling styles within an ED just to confuse the enumerators. Or at least that appears to be the case. We won't know this for sure until we get to see the actual census pages. What can we expect to find in the 1940 and 1950 censuses? For the most part, it will be the same sorts of things that we are probably familiar with from previous census years. That includes things like street and house number, name of each person in the household, relation of each person to the head of household, sex, color, or race, age, marital status, etc. But there were several new questions and several questions that were dropped. The questions shown here identify the property and were asked only of the head of household. Note that in 1940 they asked for the house value if owned or the monthly rent if rented. Those were nice things to know about your ancestor, but unfortunately they dropped those questions in 1950. These questions identified the person. An S indicates that the question was asked only on the sampling line, and an SS indicates that the question was asked on the extra sampling line. One of the more interesting questions was the identification of the informant. You might have seen earlier censuses of a family that you knew, and you realized that the responses were all wrong. You probably wondered who gave these wrong answers. Was it the head of the household, who should have known better, or was it the 6-year-old who was the only person in the household who spoke English? The 1940 census was the first one that identified the informant. The informant's name was followed with an X in a circle. That was a good thing. Unfortunately, that was dropped in 1950. The 1950 instructions did say that the enumerator should note if the answers were provided by a neighbor, but even that might not have been done by all enumerators. Another interesting question introduced in 1950 was years in current marital status. Previous censuses asked questions like years in current marriage, but that didn't apply to divorced people, for example. The 1950 question would tell us how long the person had been divorced. Both the 1940 and 1950 censuses asked about previous marriages, but the 1940 census discriminated and asked that question only to females. The 1950 census didn't discriminate. Most censuses asked for a place of birth, and that would mean the country if born outside of the U.S. And country meant the country as of the time the census was taken. But in 1940, the country boundaries in Europe were in a state of flux. So rather than ask the person for his country of birth based on a 1940 map, he was asked for his place of birth based on the map as it existed in 1937. One of the more controversial questions on the census was the citizenship question. It was asked in the 1940 and 1950 census and in several censuses prior to that. But it has not been asked since 1950, and you probably all remember the controversy this caused when it was proposed for the 2020 census. Here are some other questions identifying the person. In 1940, they asked if the person was a veteran, and they wouldn't discriminate on the basis of age. So they would ask a newborn if he or she was a veteran. In 1950, they became more selective and asked the question only if the person was over the age of 14. And they would not ask that question to females because everyone knew that females couldn't serve in the armed forces. In 1940, they asked if the person had a Social Security number. The Social Security system started in the mid-1930s, so they wanted to see how widespread it was in its first few years. By 1950, enough people were in the Social Security system, so this question was no longer of interest. They asked many questions about work in 1940 because of the Great Depression. They asked not only what was your current occupation, but also what was your usual occupation. They wanted to determine if you were able to get employment in the field that you were trained in, or if you just took any job so as to put food on the table. Many of these questions carried over to 1950 as well. In 1940, they asked the income question for the first time. This was a very interesting question for genealogists, because now we could get to see how well off or not well off our grandparents were. But income was a very controversial question, and many people refused to answer it. So the census taker would leave an envelope with the respondent, allowing him to mail in his answers to the income question. In 1950, the income question was moved to the sampling line. In 1950, they extended the income question to all members of the household and not just the head of household. So now we could get to see the income of not just Donald, but of Daisy, Huey, Dewey, and Louie as well. There were many questions that were proposed by various lobbying groups, but rejected by the Census Bureau. Here is a list of some rejected questions for 1940, and I presume there were similar rejected questions in 1950. You can probably guess as to which group proposed which questions. For example, the hair coloring question was probably proposed by the manufacturers of hair coloring products. Our first example, Donald Duck, showed how to find the ED number for someone living in a large city. This second example will show how to find the ED for a small rural area. And what rural area could be smaller than Smallville, the hometown of Superboy? For those of you who don't know, Superboy is Superman when he was a boy. Let me say a few words on how the same unified ED finder can be used for both large cities and small rural areas. In the case of large cities, we have tables generated by our team of volunteers that lists every street in the city and every ED that street passes through. The ED finder consults these tables to zero in on the ED based on streets and cross streets. In the case of rural areas, our volunteers have transcribed the definitions of every ED in the country, and we search through those transcriptions to determine the ED for the rural area. The definitions exist on narrow microfilm, but you can't do searches through microfilm. That's why we had our volunteers transcribe them. It should be noted that although NARA has the microfilm, they do not have the transcriptions. So for the 1940 census, they came to us asking if they could have our transcriptions. They have not yet asked for our 1950 transcriptions, but we assume that they will. Smallville is a small town, obviously, so it was not likely to be one of those for which we generated street tables. The one-step unified ED finder can still be used, but in this case, select Other for the town. And type in the town name. Once Smallville is typed in, a list of all the EDs in Kansas whose definitions include the word Smallville will be displayed. Pressing the More Details button will show us the definition of all those EDs so we can make a determination as to which one is the most likely. Here we see that the two EDs that mention Smallville are for Smallville Township and Smallville Jail. We can assume that Superboy was not living in the Smallville Jail, so that narrows it down to ED 15-3. To illustrate yet another way that the ED finder can be used, let's find Uncle Harry in the 1950 census. Harry and his wife lived in Roswell, New Mexico. When I give this talk live, I ask the audience if they know what Roswell is famous for, and usually several people shout out aliens. Harry and his wife were illegal aliens. They entered the country by flying in using a saucer-shaped flying machine, and they would frequently take joyrides in it. In 1947, they had a tragic accident. Their flying machine crashed at what is known as Area 51, and Harry's wife was killed. The Army recovered her body, but never returned it to the family. You probably read about that as it was a major news story at the time. We don't know Harry's address in 1950, but we do have Harry's 1940 census record. It indicates a ward number, namely Ward 2. Harry didn't move around much. He tried to remain under the radar, so he was probably in the same ward in 1950. To find Harry's 1950 ED, we again use the Unified ED Finder and select Other for the city name, even though Roswell is in the list of cities. That will allow us to type in the city name. If we type in Roswell, we will get many EDs, all of which mention Roswell in their definition. We can reduce the number of EDs by typing in Roswell Ward 2. The Unified ED Finder will search the definitions of all EDs in New Mexico, looking for those that specify not just Roswell, but specify Ward 2 as well. The next example has to do with a famous crooked street in San Francisco. Lombard Street, between Hyde Street and Leavenworth Street, is affectionately referred to as the crookedest street in the world. It is not really, and there is another street in San Francisco that is even crookeder, but it is not as well landscaped and so has never become a tourist attraction. Here is a map showing the crooked part of Lombard Street. The map even shows the crookedness of the street. If we use the one-step Unified ED Finder and enter Lombard Street and Hyde Street, we get two EDs. We'll add the other cross street, Leavenworth, in an attempt to reduce it to a single ED. But by doing so, we still have two EDs. Why didn't we get a unique ED? That's probably because the two sides of Lombard are not on the same ED. The odd numbers on the block are in one ED, and the even numbers in the other ED. We'll go back to the map to determine the back street that completes the city block. We'll focus on the south side of Lombard, so the back street will be Greenwich Street. We add Greenwich, and that gets us down to a single ED, namely 38-424. Before running to view the census images, it will be a good idea to verify that the ED found is indeed correct. It could take a considerable amount of time to step through every page of an ED looking for the family, and it would be a shame to go through an entire ED only to later learn that it was the wrong ED. Here are some additional one-step tools that can be used to verify the correctness of the found ED. All of these can be accessed as standalone tools on the One-Step website. But the first four are also integrated into the Unified ED Finder, making it indeed a unified tool. First, there's a transcribed ED definition tool, which we already saw with the Superboy example. Let's go back to the Crooked Street results. And note that there is a More Details button next to the resulting EDs. Clicking on that button will bring up a one-step tool that displays the transcribed definitions of the ED. The transcribed results displays a view link. Clicking on that link brings up the original ED definition as it appears on the microfilm. Another thing that would be useful is to obtain a list of all the streets within the ED. That can be obtained from the Unified ED Finder by selecting the Streets in the ED option before clicking on the ED number. And here we see the list of streets that are in the same ED as the south side of the Crooked Street. Of course, it would be useful to look at an ED map to determine the correct ED. As soon as a county is selected in the Unified ED Finder, or a city if the county is not specified, an ED map button appears. Clicking on the button brings up a list of the ED maps for the county. After examining several maps, we will eventually get to the portion of the county that we are interested in. And here is a portion of the map showing the boundaries of ED 38-424. For brevity, the map does not show the ED prefix. Many cities are broken up into census tracts. These tracts provide stable geographic units for the presentation of statistical data across census years. For our purposes, we can use the tracts as an aid for determining the ED because the ED definitions usually include tract numbers. We do that by using the census tract maps to determine the relevant census tract. And then using the Unified ED Finder, we find the ED within that tract. The tract for the crooked part of Lombard Street can be obtained by using the one-step census tract tool. That tool will bring up the census tract map for San Francisco. And that map shows that the crooked street is in the census tract 82. We can now return to the Unified ED Finder and type San Francisco Tract 82 for the city rather than selecting San Francisco from the list of cities. This will give us 9 EDs. If we ask for more details about these EDs, we get the descriptions shown here. And from these descriptions, we see that the ED we want is 38-424. The one-step tool for dealing with large cities involves selecting specific streets from a list of streets. But sometimes the desired street or cross streets are not in the list. That's because street names change over the years. Sometimes they no longer exist, and sometimes the house numbers change. There are many other reasons that a street name would be changed. To help in such situations, there is a one-step tool that deals with changed street names and changed house numbers. It consists of a list of about 250 cities and shows the old street names and the corresponding new names for each. The largest collection of tools for converting location information to ED is found on the One-Step website, and they are all free. But the number of census tools found there can be daunting. To simplify things, a tutorial quiz was developed whereby you will be asked a sequence of questions, and based on your answers, you will be directed to the most appropriate one-step tool or tools for your situation. The tutorial quiz is another tool on the One-Step website. The main tool on the One-Step website is the Unified ED Finder. The tool consolidates the functions of many other tools, and in most cases is the only tool needed. After a while, a name index will be produced for the 1950 census, and when that happens, it will be much simpler to find people in that census. Two questions come to mind when a 1950 name index becomes available. Question 1. Will the One-Step site support the 1950 name index? Yes, it will. The One-Step site contains a form for searching for people in prior census years, and that form will be expanded to include 1950 as well. Question 2. Will the One-Step 1950 location tools become obsolete? The One-Step site contains location tools for the years 1880 to 1940, and these are not obsolete, even though name indexes exist for those years. And the reason the location tools are not obsolete is because not everyone can be found by doing a name search. To understand why, consider the way the census takers did their job. The census taker arrived at your ancestor's door with his census book in his hand. He didn't say, "Here is a census book, please write your name in it." Instead, he probably said that the book was government property, and not only couldn't your ancestor write in it, he couldn't even look at it. That was because the book contained confidential information about his neighbors. So the census taker asked your ancestor to say his name, and the census taker would write it down. Your ancestor might have been an immigrant who spoke with a thick accent and had a long Eastern European name. In that case, the census taker would take his best guess as to what your ancestor said, and he would write down what he thought he heard. 72 years later, commercial websites are going to create a name index. They will do so by having transcribers read the census records and type in what the census takers wrote down. The census takers were not known for having great handwriting, so the transcriber will need to make his best guess as to what the census taker wrote down, which would be the census taker's best guess as to what he thought your ancestor said. It's like the game of telephone, and the chances of getting it right get less and less. But it's not as bad as all that. In 90% of the cases, you will have no trouble finding your ancestor by doing a name search. But I hate to give numbers like that because you all know that 87% of statistics are just made up. In most cases, there will be no trouble doing a name search, but there will be those cases, and you will run into them, where no matter how creative you are with your name searches, you will not be able to find your ancestor. In those cases, the location tools will still be necessary. I like to illustrate the problem with the transcribers by comparing it to putting lipstick on a pig. To make the point, here is an actual census page for the 1940 census. It is for the Donardo family and has family members Domenico, Dominica, Natalie, and Humbert. The last line was less intelligible, but probably readable by most native English speakers. Can you read it? Here is how the people with the strong character recognition abilities transcribed it. They got the first four right, but they transcribed "not Christian yet" as "watch not in edget." Here is how the One-Step site will handle the name searches. There already is a one-step form as shown here, and it includes all the years up to 1940. When the name index for 1950 is available, the form will be extended to include 1950. The one-step name search will involve accessing the name index on other websites, so you might wonder why we don't simply go to those websites directly. That's because the one-step search form will include features not found on the underlying site. It will probably contain more search fields than will be found on the underlying website. It already has more fields for the earlier census years. Another feature is that there is a single one-step name search form that lets us search in any particular year. Suppose we have just found our ancestor in the 1920 census, and now we want to search for him in the 1930 census. His name hasn't changed. His year and place of birth haven't changed. And he probably has other attributes that have remained the same from one census year to the next. Yet on many of the commercial sites that have a search by name capability, we are required to leave the 1920 search form, go up several levels through their site to get out of 1920, then come down several levels in 1930 before we get to their 1930 search form. Then we have to enter the information all over again. From the one-step search by name form, we simply change the year, which is one of the fields on the form, and repeat the search with all the other values left intact. Another advantage is that the one-step site will provide name search and location search all on the same site. And there will probably be other advantages as well. Moral: there's more than one way to skin a cat. The trick is to try several of the one-step tools and see if we get the same ED. Here's our toolbox of 1950 ED tools. We discussed all of these tools already, so I won't repeat it. Expect the unexpected. There are several anomalies in the 1950 census that were not present in previous census years. We'll need to know about them so that we don't get confused when searching in the census. One of these anomalies are the A and B sheets. From 1880 to 1940, the census population schedules, what is typically referred to as the census, were printed back to back. The front sheet was numbered with an A and the back sheet with a B. The numbering sequence was 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B, etc. In 1950, the census population schedule and the census housing schedules were printed back to back, so there was no longer a need for the A and B indicators. Note that the census consists of several parts called schedules. There is the population schedule, the housing schedule, the agricultural schedule, the veteran schedule, etc. Unless noted otherwise, the term census, as used in this talk, refers to the population schedule. Next, there is the numbering gap. Well, why are so many pages missing? Prior to 1940, all pages were numbered consecutively, starting at 1A. The next page would be 1B, then 2A, then 2B, etc. If the census taker finished visiting all the homes in the district and went back to trying to get people that he might have missed, those people would appear on pages numbered immediately after the last page of the first set of visits. Since the census taker was being paid by the name, he was very motivated to find more people. In 1940, his instructions were to start the second set of visits on page 61A, regardless of the page number on which the first set of visits ended. This assumes that the last page number of the first set of visits was less than 61A. Furthermore, on April 8th and 9th, he was to visit hotels and flop houses looking for transients, and those visits were to start on page 81A. Assume that the first set of visits ended on page 40B. The second set of visits would start on 61A, and the pages from 41A to 60B will appear to be missing. But they aren't missing, they never existed. So just because we see these numbering gaps, we shouldn't use them as an excuse for not being able to find our family in the census. True numbering gaps can be easily detected because each of the A pages, 1A, 2A, etc., has a second number which is stamped on the top rather than being handwritten. Those stamped numbers should not have any gaps. A similar situation existed in 1950, but the details are a bit different. Instead of the second visit starting on page 61A, they started on page 71. Tea night in 1950 was when the transients were enumerated. On April 11th, the higher class transients were enumerated, those in hotels, wines, and tourist courts. And on April 13th, the lower class transients were counted, those in flop houses and missions. But the instructions to enumerators does not designate the page on which the transient enumerations are to appear. In fact, as of this recording, it is not clear where those enumerations are located. We won't know the answer until we get to see the census pages. Here's a notice that was posted at the various hotels informing the guests that they would be counted that night. Now for college students. Prior to 1950, college students were enumerated at their parents' home, even though they were probably away at school when the census taker arrived. In 1950, they were enumerated at their college address. This is consistent with the general census rule. Each person shall be enumerated as his usual place of residence. Keep this in mind when looking for college students in the census. Each person should be enumerated as his usual place of residence. Expect more from the census. Here's Donald's census record, where he gives his occupation as trained doc, his industry is comics, and he indicates that he worked for a private employer. Next to that, there are 3 columns that the census taker left blank. After the census taker turned in his forms, people at the Census Bureau would add codes in those blank columns. The codes would group various occupations into one category, so the government could get a count as to how many people were in each category. And in Donald's case, the occupation was assigned code 430. Furthermore, the industry was assigned code 859, and his class of worker was assigned code 1. It would be nice to know what these codes actually meant, because then that would tell us what the Census Bureau thought of Donald's line of work. The One-Step website has tools for decoding the various code numbers that were added to the census in the years from 1910 to 1950. Here is the tool for the occupation codes in 1950. We enter the values that we saw on the census, and we see that they classified a trained doc with hucksters and peddlers, and comics with miscellaneous entertainment. What do others have to say about the One-Step census tools? We found quite a few references to our 1940 census tools when the 1940 census was about to be released. For brevity, I'll just show this one from the NARA website that appeared before the 1940 census was opened. They said that you can prepare for the census opening by using the tools on the Steve Morse website. And recently, NARA put out a press release for the 1950 census. And in their press release, they stated that the ED descriptions will be on their website eventually, but in the meantime, the descriptions can be found on the Steve Morse website. So where is the Steve Morse website? First, I'll tell you where it is not. You don't get to it by going to stevemorse.com. If you do, you'll get to a website of a motorcycle riding guitarist who claims to have the official Steve Morse website. This is not the official Steve Morse website. This man is an imposter. The way to get to the real Steve Morse website is to go to stevemorse.org. If you do that, you'll get to the one-step website containing all the census tools discussed in this lecture. And one of those tools is actually a link to a paper titled Getting Ready for the 1950 Census, Searching with and Without a Name Index. If that sounds familiar, it should. It's the title of this lecture. The paper and the lecture were written together, so if you didn't understand anything in the lecture, you can read about it in the paper. Let me close by reminding you that on opening day there will be no name index. The only way to access a census will be by knowing the ED, and the easiest way to determine the ED will be by using the tools on the one-step website. There is no charge for using the one-step tools, so the one-step website should be one of the first sites you visit on opening day. However, you might be better off not waiting for opening day, but rather obtaining your EDs from the one-step website now. There will probably be an onrush of people coming to the one-step site on opening day, slowing everything down. On the opening day for the 1940 census, back in 2012, there were over 2.25 million hits on the one-step website. Thank you for listening. Although I couldn't see or hear you, I'm sure you are a wonderful audience.